for sending it.
And I really enjoy the conversations in close protection. I enjoyed you gave a great shout out for our Inspiring Individuals event the other day, the one with Mark Six James. Anyway, we are very pleased to be joined by Charles Randolph, President of the IPSB, Chris Story, Senior Consultant, Anomaly Management Services, Brian Schofield, Director of Security, Raleigh Enterprises, and Carlos Goveo, Director of Operations at Trident Security Services. I am looking for Ben Coleman, although I can't find him, so I'm going to look for him. Chuck, you have the floor. You're going to lead us away with a wonderful panel, fireside chat, looking at the future of corporate security and EP.
Yeah. Brian, Carlos, Chris, thanks for joining. Phelim, thanks for having us. Here we are, gang, where it's the end of the day. We've been talking about modernization. We just had a great panel on threat intelligence. And now we're here and we're talking about how do we put this together as leaders, as future chief security officers, future people who have to take, whether it's pandemic risks or terrorist risks or travel security or just walking an organization through, putting in new security systems. I mean, how do we look at this in terms of the chief security officer? So Chris, I'll start with you because I know you well. How does modernization, what does it mean to technology, or can it mean adaptability? Is it process? Is it procedure? How do you think about that? If I'm asking you to do it in terms of being a CSO, how do you think they should think about that moving forward?
Well, so you kind of said, is it technology? Is it adaptability, process, procedure? And I would say yes to all of that. And the CSO, I would say this forum kind of shows the answer. The question is yes, right? I think, but part of the challenge is if I was a CSO of the future, I might be a little bit concerned because there's varying levels of opinion based on roles and people's places in the industry, and more importantly, where they've come from, right? So everybody's coming to the party with their own little hammer to hit whatever part of the nail they want to hit. And it doesn't really look like we're all on the same sheet of music, right? We're all siloed and really focused on our own areas. And we're not really, very few of us are looking at the organization as a whole and what our impact is on it. And I think, Jason Villa stated it really pretty succinctly, which is, hey, it's security is security, and how does it affect the outcome for the organization? And if we all look at it in that way, we have a better chance of providing security for the organization. But instead, physical security has one lens, and that's using better technology. EP thinks that modernization is using an app, and cyber, thinks that it completely differently. And each of those security domains, what I find is interesting is that they all have a different opinion based on with the volume of threats and how rapidly those threats approach them. Right? If you think about it, the volume of cyber and the rapidity of that is massive. So they tend to look at it at a different scale. And if you look on the bottom, or a different, domain, EP, those threats come at it pretty slowly, onesie twosies, geographically dispersed, et cetera. So it's a little bit different. It's interesting how each of them would take that approach. But I would say modernization means adapting to the threat risk environment, understanding organizational desired outcomes supported by those processes and procedures that the organization requires to best support its business. And I believe that's what the CSO of the future is going to look like in terms of modernization and look for in building its organization.
Okay, great answer.
And that's not me snoring, that's my dog.
Yeah, sure it is. Brian, I'd like to ask you to follow up with that and say, okay, given all that Chris just kind of put forth on us, it says, that's a lot of stuff that a CSO has to think about. You've been an instructor, you've been a director of security for both big business, media, et cetera. What traits does that future? So what are the traits that a future CSO needs to have now to come in and manage all of that and also manage people?
I think a future CSO is going to have a broader vision, right? A lot of times in our industry, we see people who transition in from public sector and they come in with a very sort of narrow focus. I think CSOs of the future are going to have to rely more on partnering with their IT group, their HR groups, all the other entities that make up an organization to make sure that they're in line with whatever the organization's mission is, and making sure that they're taking advantage of any opportunity to find crossover in modernization, not just on the security side, but perhaps on the HR system side or workflow or processes that security has a part of, could really advance the CSO's status in a organization.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, sometimes are we slaves to the myopic vision of a CSO? Maybe, you know, I came from another organization, whether it's a military or government or law enforcement or somewhere where things have been mandated, and now I walk out maybe to the private sector and wait, the mandate is different. You know, we have to look at the 10K risk. We have to look at other things that inform and drive our mission and our maybe our vision, as you say. I like that idea. How do you view that as if you're coming into a new organization, especially with a modernization lens on it, and say, how am I now going to create a vision and a mission for myself to move forward and try to drive some modernization or get my hands around what this new idea of combined threat might be?
Well, hopefully, if you're a CSO, you're already coming in with a vision, and you've got an idea how to get there and how to do it.
One hopes.
There are people out there who specialize in helping to develop your mission statements and your organizational structure and all that other kind of stuff. I think it's going to depend, though, on the level of experience that a CSO has, an emerging CSO has, either coming from public or private sector, with understanding how organizations work, because each organization has its own way of doing things, right? Chris from Netflix has a totally different way of doing things than, say, Dave Q from Apple. So they all have different things that they have to pay attention to, and that's really the thing that I focus on, is understanding the organization that you're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. Carlos, good to see you again, my friend, and thanks for joining us on here. Question for you: how does tech inform that? You know, if we think specifically for a minute, modernization and tech, which I agree, modernization, Chris, is all things, but let's think about tech just for a minute. Does tech help us? Does it hurt us? How would we use it as a CSO to get a good overall picture and inform our metrics, but not let it get in our way of doing the job of risk mitigation? You muted, my friend.
I would just like to concur with what he said.
We're all technological slaves at this moment. Carlos, are you on? Nope. Okay, Chris, I'm going to come back to you. Carlos, don't go back on mute. We'll let your audio connect. But Chris, we'll come back to the tech piece. But Chris, I'd like to come back to you and say, as the new CSO, the future CSO that has to come in and understand and drive, you know, intelligence requirements in an organization and get all these, you know, have walks with all these people across the enterprise that we need to bring together, as Brian was saying, you know, what's your first 30 days look like in office as a CSO, walking in on a new organization or walking in on new threats and saying, okay, how are we going to re-examine this now?
Well, I think kind of like Brian was saying, your first 30 days are meeting with those partners. I think too often we've been disassociated. We're the self-licking ice cream cone. We're special because we're security, et cetera. And here's what we're going to do. But, you know, and then at the same time, we beat ourselves up for not having a seat at the table. I think really getting in and understanding who your partners are, what risks they've faced, what risks they faced in the past, what challenges they faced in the past, in the recent past. Although organizations and people in them tend to have very, very long memories when it comes to things going wrong, and very short-term memories when things go right. It's being open and telling people that you're there as a partner to help solve some of those problems, which ingrains that, is able to bring you to that seat at the table, that you're there to solve some of those problems and work on those immediately. At the same time, you're trying to understand from your perspective, from a security perspective, because that's what you're there for, is to understand what risks truly face the organization and where you can make the impact. So it's understanding your role from the security perspective, but also understanding your role from a partner perspective and helping solve those problems internal with the organization so that you can make the greatest impact that you possibly can as you go in. If you just go in to solve security problems, you're going to be behind the power curve.
Chris, is the CSO of the future? Are they cyber? Are they physical? What are they?
Yes, I think the CSO of the future has to be a generalist, right? I mean, we've got to get away from this cyber physical. I only do this. They've got to be a great generalist that knows how to which domain to put forth to what problem, and quite honestly, we're going to start seeing that we're getting away from, hey, this is a physical security problem, because it's going to be supported by a cyber issue, right? Or it's an executive problem that needs, threat intelligence that is also supported by cyber. So we're going to have to get away from these siloed domains and really work together. And you're going to start to see, I think, some more, lower level, level 1, level 2, level 3 generalists that have a good handle on a lot of the domains rather than just one.
No, I agree. I think the CSO of the future is somebody that walks in and says, okay, what's this SolarWinds thing? Okay, what are we doing in terms of where are we now? How does it affect all domains of the business? And then are we reaching out to our partners? Carlos, let's go back to you on the tech issue. And hopefully, speaking of tech, we've sorted that out. Are you able to join us? Still on mute, my friend. Still on mute.
Carlos, one option,
Brian,
if you dial the number I've sent you, I will pipe in that audio feed. So keep your video where it is, but dial that phone number, which I've sent you, and I'll pipe in your audio, no problem.
I'm going to say I've been where Carlos is. It is not awesome.
No, I feel the pain. Brian, let me ask you your thoughts in terms of, we've been listening to modernization and where all the elements of, mostly physical security, but if we take the entire domain of risk and really look at the chief security officer as also a chief risk officer, in your view, in your experience, what do you feel is the tip of the spear for the security apparatus, in the new norm, if you will?
I think that's a challenging question, because I think
is it Intel? Is it?
Yeah, that's a challenging question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the organization's mission. In some instances, it could very well be physical. In others, it could be human intelligence. In others, it could be cyber intelligence. I think it's just really going to depend on what is the mission of the particular company, what is their focus, and that will sort of determine, I think, where they are in their modernization plan of what is going to become the tip of the spear. From my perspective, it is protective intelligence. It is gathering the information of where you're going to, either as a travel advisor or a risk consultant or a security consultant. You really just have to know what's the organization's mission and what are you getting yourself into. And that will, from my perspective, determine what might be the tip of the spear. It could very well be legal, for all we know. It just sort of depends on what's going on.
No, I think that's a great answer, because you do have to understand what is the organization say its main points are that it's working towards. What does it say in terms of, you have 10K risk reports, and as I said earlier, that kind of inform to what the greatest threats are. And as a CSO, you have to look at those and ask, where is it? And it could shift. You're right. Given at any given moment, it could shift to somebody's the tip of the spear now, somebody's tip of the spear 5 minutes from now. I do believe you're right. Intelligence is probably going to continue to be foremost in most organizations' mind, especially the idea of a intelligence-driven, operations-led mantra. What questions, once you know the mission of the organization and you're a more modernized CSO, if you will, and you are walking around and having those walking meetings with your key individuals, what questions do you ask them to make sure that they're driving to the right mission, driving to the right vision in what the risk for the corporation is? What do you want to know from them?
Yeah, I think it's understanding, again, what are their priorities? Are people the priority? I hope they are, but in some instances, they might not have a lot of people to work with. It might be more on the, it could be anything that falls in their remit. But for me, it's what are their priorities? What are they looking at? What are the next 18 months, 2 years look like? Where should the CSO start thinking about in terms of long-term planning? And it's just really understanding what's their priority for me. Those are the questions I would ask.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Carlos, I think we have you now with piped in from the nether regions. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. And I guess my answer is going to be, I agree with everything you guys said. Sounds great.
Well, let's go back to this tech idea. And how do we use tech if we're at a CSO level and we're thinking forward thinking, how do we use it to augment what we're doing to make decisions as a CSO, and how can it get in our way?
So I think it can get in our way. Obviously, we fail to do the change management, do the training, but mainly the change management that will destroy any effort to integrate anything into the enterprise. But going back to how do you maximize the use of new technology? I mean, it's a different time. Everything is social media. Everything is moving way faster than before. And that said, I wanted to go back to what Chris mentioned before. He started with the silos and folks mentioning that we need to be a converged security professional, which is kind of limited because we still look at it as physical and cyber. And like Jason said earlier, it is security, right? That's the job of the CSO, to have a coherent strategy that aggregates all the inputs that we have out there: EP, contract security guard, threat management, threat assessment, everything that comes in to keep the business safe and to increase the resilience of the enterprise. So going back to it, if you have a good strategy, you identify where you want it to go, and you identify those priority intelligence requirements for the organization, then you work backwards to identify what tools you want and what is the final product that you need to keep that strategy to enforce business continuity, resiliency, and everything else that's on the 5-year, 10-year plan.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what can reduce signals, because I think Brian brings up a good point. And Carlos, your idea in tech, I think underscores it. Look, we're most likely rarely going to get more people. It happens, it can happen, but in a lot of places you get less people and more responsibility. I think having tech augment that so that we can say, hey, take the Mark I eyeball of our threat analyst or our intelligence folks, what reduces our signals, what helps us highlight triggers and indicators. That I think that's where tech will best suit and help us out as we drive forward, to allow the people to focus on, in the requirements, what those priorities are. What do you think in terms of adapting? Like Chris mentioned earlier, we want to be good generalists. Do we want to have specialists within our organization? Like take EP. Do we want EP folks only to be focused on EP, or is it important that we cross-train them in other areas, even if it's something that might be in the digital domain or something that might be in the intelligence domain? Brian, what do you think about that?
About the being in the threat domain?
No, I'm sorry. What do you think about training our folks in terms of being generalists across the security domain at scale, so they can understand EP and digital and other things?
I think it's an absolute requirement. If you walk in siloed, I don't think you're going to understand the big picture of what your role is in your organization. I'm a huge proponent for generalists and understanding how to navigate certain situations and knowing that you're not an expert in it, but you at least know who to go talk to. So for me, being a generalist is really key. Otherwise, you're not going to find the successes that you might hope if you don't understand how things work.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, any thoughts in terms of blind spots for new CSOs? And I think you're right. Traditionally, it's always been there's a physical CSO and then there's the CISO, and now they've started, hanging out in each other's corners of the gymnasium. Now everything's together. What are the blind spots to a CSO?
I think to kind of echo Brian's comments is number one, you got to understand your organizational mission and then derive your plan to support that, right? So we talk about the new CEO or the new CSO that comes in and says, hey, here's what do I need to do, right? And then what do I need to do from a long-term perspective? And then you align your support of the organization behind that, so you can kind of look at the future. A lot of the things we've been talking about thus far have been like looking at what's facing us right now, and just sticking your face into the fire hose, and then once you do that, you really can't get your face out of it to look beyond it, right? So I would say, understanding what assets, what risks you face, what assets you have, and resources you have at your disposal, and then aligning them behind those that organizational mission is going to give you an understanding of, like, do you have what you need to accomplish the goals of the organization, and then of course your internal goals to support those goals. And then, of course, you're going to either ask for more bodies, ask for more education, or ask for technology or align technology within the organization, or other resources in the organization to support your mission, to support the organization. And I think, going back to, again, Brian's key points of creating those partnerships within the organization can help support that, and support your role, and can also help you resource better, right? If I'm working with legal and HR, et cetera, and we both have a problem to solve, or all of us have a problem to solve, it's easier for us to pool our resources together to find either resources or technology to support those problems, or solve those problems, at least to an 80% level, than it is for me to try to champion that by myself as I look as if I'm trying to create my own little kingdom for me to be the king of security versus the supporter of the organizational goals.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially in terms of there's no room for tribes. There's only room for the enterprise and covering risk at the enterprise level. Carlos, how do you recommend, at new CSOs, as we think about them being more understanding of all domains? I mean, what do you feel is priorities for people who wish to become a new CSO? If someone was to come to you and say, hey, Carlos, I want to be a CSO in 10 years, what advice would you give that person to say, here's what I feel you should focus on to be able to do that job?
So first of all, I agree with Brian. The CSO definitely needs to be a strong generalist. You have to be able to understand all the arms that are going to be under you, EP, business continuity, all the things, not to mention the actual language of the business. But if you're going to say, hey, my goal is in 10 years to be a CSO, I would say it comes out of the security realm and business, and saying, read some psychology, learn to understand leadership, because the generalist part of the job, we know it. You're going to learn it. You're going to learn it from the previous jobs. It's just leading sometimes is harder than just knowing security, and that will bring some challenges to the table. Speaking the language of the business, and I think project management and strategy, those things will save your life.
Yeah, I absolutely. And this idea of being a generalist, I think, cannot be stressed enough. I think if you're a reader, and not a paid advertisement, but I really enjoyed, I think it was David Epstein. He wrote a book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. It's not a security related book, but it's a great book for anyone, especially a future CSO, to have on your shelf, because it really does talk about, how do we as leaders come in and take all these specialists and say what's important here? Because security, as we all know, can be very myopic at times. We get caught up in our whack-a-mole wherever we are in that segment, and then it does take good generalists to come in and say what's all important here and drive an organization. What about you, Brian? Same question to you. What would you give as recommendations for a young person that came and said, hey, Brian, I want to be a CSO in 10 years. What should I focus on?
So great question. I'm biased because I do teach change leadership at university. So for me, it's understanding change leadership, how to bring change to an organization. The book that I teach from is John Kotter, Leading Change. And from my perspective, it's continuing to develop your leadership skills, continuing to develop your strategy, and and understand the bigger thinking that goes into a CSO role is what I would recommend for people, and what I do recommend to people I coach. Continuing to attend these types of panels is very helpful, and continuing to network. And the last and most important thing for me is find a few mentors, find people that you can ring on the phone and say, I've got a question. How would you handle this? What do you do? That for me has been the most impactful part of my career is having people that I can call on as a mentor, not as a partner or someone that I work with, but someone that I can call and say, I'm having this experience. What would you advise? And that's for me, the pillars that I would fall under is change leadership and mentors.
Yeah, that's great. And great, Cotter's great stuff as well. So appreciate that. Shout out. Chris, over to you with a slight little nuance to it as well. Same question. I want to be a CSO in 10 years. What should I focus on? But in particular, if they said, what should I focus on in terms of thinking around organizations that are modernizing? Is there a way to kind of set yourself up to be able to adapt quickly?
I guess it kind of it depends where you come from, right? Again, to echo Brian and Carlos's points, I mean, great points in setting up. The only thing I would say is probably communication, right? Because as most of us come from either the military or law enforcement, and now finally we're getting some folks come in from civilian areas or sectors or whatever you want to call it. But often we have a hard time, this kind of echoing what Carlos was talking about, is the ability to communicate in terms of what the organizational level communication, which is what essentially CSOs have to do. So depending on your background, where you came from, I'd offer communication number one, and then of course, I hate to say it, but technology number two. And I don't mean like what is happening now and what are we doing with social media and what, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but what's the emerging technology that we're gonna have to face, as we look at Moore's Law. What does that mean now? What does that mean 2 years from now? What does that mean 4 years from now? And what we find is most security innovators are looking at leaping the gap, if you will, which means I'm not looking at the problems that we're facing now. The gap is what are the problems that we'll be facing after what we're facing now, or even further, what are the third generation problems that we'll be having, and what do we need to face, and what does it look like within the organization? Because one of the things that has been really prevalent in this conversation is, as security practitioners, CSOs, directors, et cetera, we have to face what's in front of us, not off, and get competent at that really, really quickly. And we don't often have the time to get, sort those things out and rehearse them and rehearse critical crisis management and then be competent at that. It's almost a constant react mode. So if we have to kind of look into the future to figure out what we're doing so that we can start looking at facing the threats that are just beyond the horizon based on the threats that we're facing now. So I'd say is, almost become a futurist, if you will.
Well, I think and with that also becomes, going back to the points we've all talked about earlier, understanding what your organization is about, understanding their mission, understanding the threats that we faced, trying to inform about the threats that we may see, and then scenario-based scenario-based operations, which also includes intelligence. Something I would say most CSOs of the future might want to think about understanding is wargaming. And I'm not talking about playing Risk or Stratego, but understanding the idea that we can take from the military, like, hey, we think these are our biggest things we might face. So instead of running around and trying to follow every APT, advanced persistent threat, let's understand the triggers and indicators of the techniques that are being used. And that's one way that we can look for issues in the net, if you'll say. But then taking those scenarios and understanding how can we build around these scenarios will help us get more quickly to answering the issue. And then also it will be an adaptable organization that will consistently and constantly be looking at scenarios. Phelim, I know you're here and you're lurking in the background. I'd ask the same question to you. I mean, you've consumed all this information and you talk to a great amount of people about modernization. If somebody came to you and said, hey, Phelim, I want to be a CSO in 5 to 10 years, what should I focus on? What would your response to that be?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm really flattered that you want to ask me. I'm supposed to be the talking head, although let's face it, I do end up listening to a lot of what people are saying. And so I guess I think it's anybody who wants to be a CSO is going to have to learn sales, or they're going to have to learn some sort of communications course, because the only way you're going to do it is to persuade somebody senior who doesn't understand security that, first of all, you're the right person for the job, that second of all, you'll have the confidence of the people underneath you, and I guess you have to sell it to them. So this is why when we talk about, can the CSO be a lawyer? Could the CSO be an accountant? I mean, absolutely, it could be. They just have to sell it. I mean, one thing they could do is find a way to make security not a cost center, but a revenue center. That would immediately sell it to the board. But I think whoever it's going to be, it unfortunately will not be the diligent, hardworking person that's really good at their job, because that person will remain in their job, doing their job, because people will want them to be there. The people who seem to really thrive are the people who can communicate upwards, downwards, and sell a vision. And that's how management works all over the place, isn't it? It's never the person that's really good. It's the person that's, of course, maybe really good, but on top of it, they can sell a vision. So that's my thought. Does that sound like a plausible thought?
Yep. No, I think that's great. Somebody once told me the minute you're a CSO, you have a target on your back. And I disagree with that. And I think the way to get around that, you're right, 100% is above all else, you need to be able to be a generalist, be communicative, and run a people, what did we used to say, mission first, but people always organization. So Brian, Carlos, Chris, thanks for joining me at the end of the day and kind of putting all this together for the folks in the audience who've been listening all day. Really appreciated the time with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise, good to see you guys.
And thank you very much to all the panelists. Chuck, would you like to tell people how the IPSB in Vegas is going?
It's going great. So the Close Protection Conference is on for December. We've had several members of the board. Chris is a member of the board. You had Kristen on earlier, also a member of the board. The call for presentations is out, Phelim, and we are starting to put together what or craft